You're watching ACT.tv. I'm Julianna Forlano. Our next guest is Shahid Buttar, who is currently campaigning for Nancy Pelosi's seat in Congress. Shahid has worked on a number of progressive issues, including LGBTQ rights, privacy, immigration rights, campaign finance reform, government transparency, international human rights, and police accountability. He's here now to talk about why this is the moment to unseat Nancy Pelosi in favor of a progressive change maker like himself. Shahid, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
No, it's great. What inspired you to run for Congress?
You sort of led into this in the tail end of your interview with John. Bernie's campaign in 2016 was a big signal to me that the vision that I had thought was one that we shared in isolation was actually shared by a broad swath of America. And frankly, I think the 2020 race, while Biden ended up the nominee, I think it only proved the point. Bernie had vastly more support than any other candidate in the race, and Biden doesn't have nearly as much support. What he had was the antithetical support of centrists who wanted not to see Bernie be the nominee. But that aside, I saw Bernie demonstrate both that democratic socialism is a widely shared perspective and set of concerns around the country, and he showed, for me, for the first time in American politics, how to run a campaign in a way that builds and supports underlying social movements. I've always seen electoral politics as a hole in the bucket of democracy, sapping energy and attention from the grassroots networks that do the powerful work to advance issues. And Bernie promoted those issues. He stood in solidarity with those movements. And it was a completely different style of politics. It unlocked to me a world of possibilities. And having seen my elected representative in Washington do so much to entrench conservative interests and figures, from George W. Bush to Donald Trump, I couldn't stand on the sideline and watch it go down any longer.
It seems to me that another thing that Bernie Sanders did for everyone is to validate having a campaign that is supported by the people. Even it's almost like if it shows your progressive credentials. You're either supported by the people or you're supported by corporate America. And also, it's not something that is then made fun of or marginalized even in the media anymore. To the good media, not the
to your point, campaign finance, I think historically had really emphasized big dollar fundraising, and that was the ticket, that was the way to credibility. And he demonstrated that, an army of small contributors. I mean, in his campaign, the average contribution was under $30. Ours is closer to $20. And, there's 20,000 people kicking in $5 and $10 a piece to fuel campaigns like ours. And not only does that confer a legitimacy because we're representing real people instead of capitalists deploying capital that they've taken from other people's labor, right? But it also demonstrates what we're about and why we're there. The fact that everyday American people without careers, without comfort and without the kind of luxuries that many of the large dollar political contributors enjoy, that those people, that the working class is jumping in, that also fuels the campaigns and indicates whose interests we're there to promote. And I do have a great deal of gratitude, not only for Bernie Sanders and the demonstration, the example he demonstrated, but also the tens of thousands of supporters for our campaign from around the country. In every neighborhood in San Francisco, every state in the union is supporting our campaign. And for me as an immigrant, it's particularly humbling to have this opportunity at this moment in American history when so many of our basic values are being called into question by an aspiring tyrant.
Can you talk about the difference between yourself and Nancy Pelosi?
Sure. Nancy Pelosi is a career incumbent. She served in office for 30 years. She's a wealthy landlord worth $100 million. I'm an immigrant to the United States. I don't own any property. I've dedicated my career to defending the rights of my neighbors. I've had a chance to do that in some prolific ways over the last 20 years. And when it was fighting George W. Bush's wars, and when it was fighting Obama's deportations and crackdowns on the press, or Trump's corruption, across the 20-year arc of my activism there, I consistently had to fight Pelosi's complicity. And Nancy Pelosi has a reputation constructed by corporate media sources and right-wing media sources for supposedly being a lion of the left. She is anything but that. She is the leader of a Democratic Party who supports Republican policies, who supports Republican figures. She enables a criminal president even while continually engaging in merely theatrical so-called resistance that paves his road. She recently expanded his surveillance powers that the administration could well use to criminalize activists participating in the movement for Black Lives. Nancy Pelosi gave him $5 billion to fund his concentration camps on the border. She supports his uh, xenophobic foreign policy. She supports his corporate trade policy. She imposes Republican fiscal austerity rules. She keeps Congress in the dark and hides executive secrets. There are so many ways below the radar screen of corporate media in which Nancy Pelosi serves effectively as a deputy for Trump. And she has long served as a deputy for the GOP. And that would be one thing if she had an R after her name, but she has a D after her name. And it
Yes.
would be one thing to do so much to empower the executive branch. Did she serve within it? But she serves at the top of the legislative branch. So in both an institutional way, Congress vis-a-vis the executive branch, and in a partisan way, Democrats versus Republicans, she basically undermines both the Democratic Party and Congress, the two institutions that she heads. She subverts by promoting the interests of the other team. And that's not a narrative that you'll get watching MSNBC. But unfortunately, the facts, if you look closely enough, and I've had the opportunity to do that, reveal a very different picture than I think your casual political observers have internalized.
We're speaking with Shahid Buttar, candidate for Nancy Pelosi's House seat. Do you feel, the rest of the country relies on California to be as progressive as possible? Do you think that California is, aware of Nancy Pelosi's centrism or republicanism, and what kind of feedback are you getting in terms of whether the state is ready for a change?
Yeah, certainly the state is ready for a change. And to some extent, it's a different question for the election because we only represent San Francisco. It's just one congressional district. So I think the state and even the nation as a whole recognizes the role that she plays to do so much to advance Republican policies, even as the head of the Democratic Party. The challenge, of course, is that she's so wealthy and she's been so effective at doling out patronage that she's bought the support of many local figures. And like any House seat, it's ultimately a local race. And because she's the Speaker of the House, it's a local race with immense federal significance. And there's certainly a lot of interest and change. I am the first Democratic challenger to ever reach a November election against her, which says that at least we are the high watermark in 30 years of recognition of the possibility of a progressive alternative. I'm a democratic socialist, and I'm here, and I'm in this position because an entire generation has been shafted by the paradigm that Nancy Pelosi created. We saw in the 2008 financial crisis an entire generation watch its future go up in smoke. And it is the failure of the corporate paradigm that Pelosi has done so much to entrench that I think is driving so many people into our arms. And I was part of the Occupy movement before the movement for Black Lives. I've been a part of a number of social movements, the peace and justice movement, the anti-globalization movement, the movement for immigrant rights. And when Occupy was happening in particular, a lot of people thought that the movement was proving unsuccessful. And what they didn't realize is it just had a longer fuse than they knew. Bernie Sanders is the Occupy movement. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is the Occupy movement. And Charles
Act.tv is the Occupy movement. We came out of the Occupy movement, so
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, I came out of the Occupy movement. A lot of us did. And the point I'm making there is that what people saw in the streets, is this, we were criticized for having an abstract vision and no particular platform. And the fact of the matter is we had a platform. It was just bigger than the establishment was willing to understand or recognize or present. And now we are here to force it through Congress because the American people need universal health care. We need climate justice. We need real racial justice. We need public servants who serve us instead of murdering us in the streets. And the Democrats haven't stood for any of those things. They mouth those principles, but when push comes to shove, they vote like 90s Republicans, while today's Republicans vote like fascists. And that's a real problem. I wish I was joking here, but we very nearly in the United States experienced an authoritarian coup in the last week. The only reason that our democracy even continues to hang by a thread is because retired military generals had the professionalism. When the president invited domestic military deployment to suppress dissent, those military generals said, no, we're not doing it. But if they didn't say that, if the generals went along, what we know and love as the United States of America would have died last week. And I don't think most Americans have any sense of how close we came and how close we remain to a very darker future that doesn't allow even the vestiges of democratic participation that we enjoy and so many of us have come to take for granted.
Shahid, questions coming in from the chat, one along the lines of the one I just asked. Sourcing Support says, I would imagine that San Francisco is pretty conservative in terms of fiscal policy. Tech bros are reliant on the current neoliberal economic policies. Can we get the tech bros? And do we need them?
Yeah, absolutely. Tech is supporting our campaign. I worked at the Electronic Frontier Foundation for 5 years, and I'm impressed by how many of our supporters and contributors in particular are from the tech industry, both here across San Francisco and even across the country. Tech workers are not nearly as libertarian as their bosses. People think of Silicon Valley as a libertarian town, and that's because Zuckerberg is, that's because Peter Thiel is. The workers in Silicon Valley enterprises are as progressive as the rest of us. And frankly, even the ones who might not share a socialist perspective, they tend to be empiricists. They're not the sort to bury their head in the sand. And they understand, for instance, that the mounting global climate catastrophe will kill their kids too. It does. No amount of economic privilege can insulate people from the coming dangers, the present dangers that we have already contrived. And it's certainly true that San Francisco is both a wealthy and a destitute town. We have some of the most visible extremes of both wealth and poverty of any city in the United States. But we're also a city that is committed to human rights and freedoms. And this is the point I would make here. It's not just tech. I mean, what I'm talking about when we talk about the mass surveillance regime that Nancy Pelosi has architected and continually still continues to support, even under this criminal president, it's not privacy that I'm worried about. And I think tech workers understand that what we're talking about is democracy. If we let, and that we have already let, Nancy Pelosi let the government co-opt the internet as a tool for global surveillance. And that presents a very profound threat to human conscience and expression and democracy. And that's a perspective shared across the tech industry. I think it's one reason why so many tech workers around the country are flocking to our campaign, because they understand the dystopia that they've been unfortunately made complicit in. And I
It's
think
nice.
they're eager to have policymakers defend the integrity of their own work.
It's nice to see them rising up against Zuckerberg recently. I enjoyed hearing that the workers were holding him to task in terms of him allowing Donald Trump to use their platform as a fascist propaganda, post. And also, we're on Facebook, so just putting that out there. We have other questions coming in. You were working for the EFF for a while, as you've said. From Touring News, the question is, how can we as individuals push back against the surveillance state when both Dems and Republicans support the Patriot Act, as well as a lot of what we learned from Edward Snowden?
Wow, thank you so much for that question. It's like right down the middle of my strike zone. So just in terms of setting this up, for 6 years before joining EFF, I led as executive director the Bill of Rights Defense Committee, a group now known as Defending Rights and Dissent. I continue to serve on its board. I've been long concerned about the threat that surveillance poses to freedom of expression and, by extension, democracy. If you're concerned about the surveillance state, the very first thing you can do is proactively curate your news sources, because corporate media won't tell you what's going on. The next thing you can do is connect, think globally, and act locally. The internet has enabled us to better think globally, and in a lot of ways, it's distracted people from taking local action. And local action is critical. The work I've done over the last 10 years really focused on developing local action opportunities for people to do exactly what your questioner just asked, how to fight the surveillance state. And the key to fighting the surveillance state is to bite it off in a chunk that you can chew, which is to say, to fight it at the local level. If you can drag the surveillance state into your city council, you can kill it there. They have Congress, but they don't own your city councils. They don't own your county boards. And building coalitions of your neighbors who you can actually meet face to face, maybe not so much now during the pandemic, but local actors to whom you have greater access than counterparts in other congressional districts, for instance, mobilizing your allies to approach particularly your elected local leaders. And one of the reforms I worked on at EFF that's been passed in dozens of cities around the country are restrictions to subject policing to local oversight and control. If you can put your community between your police department and the Department of Defense or DHS or ICE, if you can put your community there as a democratic check and balance to do what the legislators don't do, that is the first step. Because once you put the community there as a process, it unlocks any number of things you can fight for. Limits on data retention, limits on data collection, limits on use. Okay, we're going to allow this automatic license plate reader system in our community, but we're not going to let ICE have it. We're not going to let the FBI have it. It's just going to be here for, if there's some, potential incident that we need to collect data for. The idea of restricting uses, dissemination, retention, all these are parameters that legislatures can adjust. And because they failed so miserably to adjust it, that's why putting the community in between is so crucial. So all that is to say, empowering communities at the local level is the key to restricting the surveillance state in the grassroots. And while that work continues to happen, I'm very eager to escalate that fight to Congress to, at the federal level, also put pressure on these agencies, take away their powers, take away their funding, give back the rights to the American people that we've lost at the hands of both Republicans and, unfortunately, Democrats too.
Shahid, another question coming in from our Twitch chat. And one of the things we try to do here is at act.tv is let the people ask you the questions that they
I
want.
appreciate that. Yeah.
Half town hall, half Julianna's curious. So coming in from our Twitch chat, Nacrastar, and also someone making a similar point, Frank, on our Facebook page. Nacrastar says, how does Shahid expect to get citizens to the ballot box? When we look at Bernie's campaign, we can see he had support from young people, but people didn't show up to vote, or at least that's what they say. So what are you doing differently to get voters excited to go vote? And a piggyback question from Frank on our Facebook page, why should I, as a US Senator Bernie Sanders supporter, vote for Biden? I know people who are willing to go through 4 more years just to punish the establishment Democrats for not putting up Bernie Sanders.
So maybe I'll try to address the first one first, just in terms of, how we're getting people to vote. The key for us, particularly during the pandemic, is phone-based outreach. So phone banking is very much where the action's at. At the moment, we're making thousands of calls a week, over 3,000 calls a week, supported by thousands of volunteers and a field staff of about 7 people who are hosting trainings, online trainings for our volunteers every 48 hours. So I'd invite anybody who's interested in joining that operation to visit us online and sign up to volunteer. We'd love to have you. And that is really the key, is connecting with people. Before the pandemic happened, when we could still meet people in person, we were at the doors, we were hosting very frequent events in locations around the city. That was a big part of how we were meeting people. And since the pandemic has really, frankly, taken off the table the opportunity to meet people in person without putting them at risk, we really have been limited to online outreach, on the phone outreach, street actions. I've been very visibly consistently participating in the recent demonstrations, and our whole team has as well. We don't think of those as so much voter outreach events, as so much solidarity opportunities.
Shahid, is the premise of the question valid, that it's young people that are supporting your campaign?
Right. Thank you for that. I was just going to press on that. Well, we have support across the demographic spectrum. Everybody from older immigrants to young white tech workers, everybody in between, all genders, all orientations, all races are supporting our campaign, all occupations even. I can think about
the beauty of San Francisco.
It's true. Well, and it's the beauty, I would say, of America. I think a lot of Americans recognize the widely shared interests that we hold in common. Interests like guarding the future from being preyed upon by the past. Interests like making sure that everybody's grandkids can survive the climate catastrophe, making sure that our neighbors can survive the police department, making sure that our basic principles and most fundamentally shared interests are ones that are guarded and protected and not simply given away to the highest corporate bidder, as corporate Democrats have been entirely too willing to do. And I think it's uniting more and more Americans. To the premise of the question, though, so our campaign is supported by people of all kinds. And I saw with Bernie's campaign, it seems like young people did vote. My sense of it is that they weren't counted. When we look at the exit polls versus the official results in many of the states that he supposedly lost, if those results didn't match up to independent corroboration in any other country, we would look at that set of facts and say that the election was suspect. And, we might harbor a false sense of security here about the integrity of our elections. I'll just say this: we better figure it out, because we have 5 months before an aspiring tyrant is either going to take advantage of an election, disregard an election, or find some way to seize and co-opt it. And election integrity matters a great deal. It's yet another issue that corporate Democrats haven't shown up for at all. And the fact that voting rights have been so thoroughly eviscerated in the years since the civil rights movement secured their historic expansion, I think, is just one among any number of reflections of the failures of the corporate Democratic Party to guard the interests of its supporters and constituents. And And I do fear that the party is paying a price now. And when we look to these demonstrations of popular support, like who do Democratic voters prefer, the faulty system skews our understanding of it. Just think about the the voter registration requirements in some states. In New York State, if you don't vote, if you don't register for the correct party many months in advance, you don't get to even cast a ballot in the primary. They tried to stop the New York primary from even happening this
I
year.
know. And here we're like, what? We're not,
Right?
yeah.
I'm in California. People forget that in 2016, the California primary was decided by the Associated Press the night before it happened. We didn't even get to vote. It was a relatively crucial state at the time. Bernie still had a chance, and they decided that Clinton won the election the night before, even though Bernie had more support here and still has more support here. He won California by a pretty wide margin this year because there's no question in California, of course, Bernie Sanders should be the next president. I mean, the idea that anybody else would be is frankly a joke. And I'm not going to say much about Biden. I mean, I I
Do you think
recognize that
people who are, do you, I mean, since there's no choice for a Bernie Sanders at this moment, do you think it's folly for people to progressives, Bernie supporters to sit home and not vote?
I think a lot of people who support Bernie will vote for Joe, but that's not the point. Voting doesn't, frankly, I mean, voting matters, but voting doesn't win. What wins elections is volunteers. And that's the issue, right? Bernie had millions of volunteers, and they weren't volunteering just because he wasn't Trump. We were volunteering because he offered something we could believe in, right? All Joe Biden is a Trump with a D after his name. And, I think we'll vote for people who aren't Trump, but are you going to get millions of young people to actually like burn their time and dedicate their time and take it away from whatever else they might do to invest in this candidate?
But is
And
that
I don't understand
necessary?
why they
Really? I
do.
mean, it's Trump. It's a Nazi or anybody. I've seen lawn signs that say anybody but Trump, and they literally mean it. So I don't know if this moment really calls for an enormous outpouring of real support. It's like you've got disaster or a slower disaster that maybe we can adjust.
Except we did this before in 2016. That was what 2016 was, and we saw how that worked out, right? I mean, the idea of running a candidate as an antithesis to that scary person,
Yes, but now we know how bad it is.
and he's stronger, and Biden is a weaker nominee than Clinton. So all that is to say, I hope
Good
Biden
point.
wins. I mean,
Yeah.
I hope not for Trump to be the president in the next cycle. I mean,
So you do encourage people to vote for Biden, even if they don't line up with his values.
particularly in battleground states. I live in a blue state that is safely going to vote blue, so I don't have to support Biden. But for somebody who lives in a state that isn't assured to vote for the Democratic nominee, I do want Trump not to be in office. And half the reason I supported Bernie Sanders is because he was far and away the strongest nominee to make sure that Trump didn't come back. And what Democrats did was coalesce around the weakest, most conservative candidate in their 20 candidate field. And the other way I'd put this, every one of our last several presidents has been an outsider, right? Trump ran as an outsider despite being an oligarch. Obama was a US senator, but he ran for the presidency as an outsider to Washington. George W. Bush was the son of a former president who ran the CIA. So again, anything but an outsider, but he presented himself as this small town yokel from Texas, right? Every one of those people took the presidency because the center has no legitimacy, and the American people for longer than a generation have wanted to throw the bums out. And so what did Democrats just do? They nominated a quintessential creature of Washington. Joe Biden has been in Washington for decades.
Okay. Yeah, that's bad.
So, I mean, all I'm saying is I don't think he can win. And even if he wins, I think we're going to have to drag him to do anything useful because he has demonstrated his conservatism in the same way that Pelosi has over and over and over again for decades. The way I would put this is if I'm so fortunate to represent my city in Washington, whether it's Trump or Biden, I'm going to be fighting them from the left. And so I'm somewhat ambivalent about the choice between them because Biden, as an agent of mass incarceration and a cheerleader for wars for profit, is going to present many of the same problems that Trump does. The one thing I will say for Trump is that he at least alarms Democrats. And I fear that Biden will lull them to sleep. And I think that's why a lot of the people you were describing are making those, you know, challenging choices. I will just say again, I encourage people to keep Trump out of the White House in battleground states. That might mean voting for Biden. I'm not going to have to do that. And I'm not going to do that. I'm going to fight Joe Biden and his policy legacy. I hope that he fights his policy legacy. If he repudiates his past and signs up to support Medicare for all and the Green New Deal, the kind of policies favored by a majority of Americans, that will put him in the White House. And I can get behind that. And so I'm eager to see him catch up and figure it out.
Another question, and I know we're almost out of time here, but from sourcing support, the comment is, up until this year, campaign finance was one of my biggest issues, but I think Bernie's campaign proved that money isn't what's stopping us from making progress. It appears to be the narratives media put forth by the established media powers. How do we combat these media monopolies in the near term?
So I'd want to challenge the premise of this question too, because the idea that money in politics is not a problem just because a handful of candidates have managed to like realize a dream, it's a false impression. And I'm happy to answer the question too, but just to deal with the faulty premise, there have been literally a handful of candidates in our history, Bernie being one of them, AOC being another, Ilhan Omar maybe being a third, who have managed to secure that opportunity through small dollar donations to develop a sufficiently wide base that can finance a national campaign operation. Taking from their examples a rule that money in politics is no longer a problem is a bit of a joke. Like, that's not at all the case. And I'd make this case three different ways. One, most progressive candidates don't have anything like that opportunity, because the only way you get that opportunity to develop that wide a base is if you get a ton of media opportunities. I ran in 2018. No one would give me a microphone. I raised $60,000 over 3 months to seek Pelosi's seat. I got as many votes that race as Ocasio-Cortez did, without any media attention. So we're back now 2 years later. We're getting a ton of media attention. And because of that, we're about to cross $1 million raised on our campaign in the next month. And that reflects, I'm very grateful for that support, but without the media attention, you don't get that kind of grassroots funding. So it's very much a chicken and egg problem, and it relates to the media sort of question that the questioner also raised. One other way I'd make this point is that even if we're lucky enough to get candidates like me, candidates like Bernie, candidates like the members of the squad, low dollar contributions in sufficient number to overcome the corporate contribution hurdle that we confront in other incumbents that we're challenging, there's still a problem with money in politics, particularly after the fact of elections. Because even after you constitute the legislature, what happens then is you go to Congress, you're in your office, there's 50 people beating down your door, 49 of them work for some corporations, and they're there with a bill that they want you to introduce. And one of them who walks through the door works for a nonprofit, and they might have a model bill. They might have some really abstract concerns that you have to figure out how to effectuate. And corporations basically they spoon feed legislators legislation. ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, is infamous for this. And that dynamic also represents the problem of money in politics in a less visible, pernicious way than at the pre-election phase. And then, finally, just to embrace the spirit of the question, the key to unlocking these media narratives is to build our own media. It's one reason why I'm so grateful for your outlet and others like you, because it is not in a critique that we have the opportunity to wrest free our media from the control of corporate conglomerates. It's in innovation and developing new voices and alternatives and supporting those voices. So acts of independent media consumption, again, proactively curating your news sources, is an active step you can take towards supporting the future, not just by arming yourself with independent information free of the bias of the corporate interlocutors, but also by building this independent media ecosystem that can enable opportunities and support voices like Charles Booker's, mine, the squad. I think the development of that independent ecosystem and people taking advantage of that ecosystem as consumers of information with more agency than just automatons, I think those are two key pieces there. Maybe the last thing I'd say here is the same guidance I gave with controlling the surveillance state. It's clear that your listener there is thinking globally. In all cases, whatever the issue, the next step is to take local action. Find someone in your neighborhood or your community. There's probably someone already working on it. Find them, join your efforts, amplify them.
We're speaking to Shahid Buttar. Shahid, thank you so much for being on the show today. He is running against Nancy Pelosi for her House seat. We wish you the best. In our Twitch chat, someone has already put a link to where you can go and support Shahid's campaign. You go to actblue.com/donate/ just Google
I can
it.
give you an easier link than that. Shahidforchange.us is our website, and I'd invite anybody to check it out. Sign up to volunteer, make a contribution, learn about the platform. Thank you so much for having me. Keep up the great.
Thank you so much, and we'll hope to have you back and support as best as we can your campaign. Thanks.
Thank you. Have a great day.